grounded in experience to which there is no contrary case, and thus no demonstration of it, even though Clarke had demanded one. Wolff and Baumgarten both attempt to provide arguments for the principle of sufficient reason, both arguing that it can be shown to follow from the principle of contradiction. But the arguments are not particularly helpful or convincing. I will not discuss Wolff's argument, rather I wish to go directly to Baumgarten's argument. As mentioned, Baumgarten has a definition of that which is something, the representable, whatever does not involve a contradiction. In the previous section, Baumgarten had given his definition of nothing, that which is both A and not A. As he puts it, there is no subject of contradictory predicates, or nothing both is and is not. This proposition is called the principle of contradiction, and it is absolutely primary. In Section 10, Baumgarten presents the principle of excluded middle. Every possible thing is either A or not A. And in Section 14, we find the rather important definition of a ratio, that from which it is knowable why something is. The argument for the principle of reason or the principle of ground now comes in Section 20, where Baumgarten writes the following. Everything possible either has a ground, ratio, or does not. If it has a ground, something is its ground. If it does not have one, nothing is its ground. Therefore the ground of every possible thing is either nothing or something. If nothing were the ground of some possible thing, it would be knowable, cognoscibile, from nothing why that thing is, and hence the nothing itself would be representable and something, and nothing would be something. Hence, something possible would be impossible. Therefore, something is the ground of every possible thing, which is to say, everything possible is a consequence, ratio natum, which is to say, nothing is without a ground, nihil est sine ratione, or when something is posited as its ground. This proposition is called the principle of ground. Haec propositio dicitur principium rationis. This argument is far from convincing. The premises cited by Baumgarten, for example, do not exactly work in the way he suggests, but it is clear that the argument is supposed to depend upon the principle of contradiction. The argument fails, however, because of Baumgarten's problematic reference to nothingness, for the crucial move in the argument is this. If nothing is the reason for some X, then that nothing is being represented as the reason for X. But whatever is representable is something and not nothing. Therefore nothing is something, and we have generated the contradiction for the reductio. It is difficult to imagine being moved by this argument. Indeed, I cannot help feeling that Schopenhauer had things right in his fourfold root of the principle of reason when he wrote of the pointlessness of the search for an argument for the principle of sufficient reason. To look for a proof of the principle of reason, Satz von Gründe, is moreover a special kind of wrongness, Verkehrtheit, showing a lack of common sense. Every proof, namely, is the explanation of the reason, Gründes, for a distinct judgment, which just through this obtains the predicate true. The principle of reason is the expression of precisely this demand for a reason, Gründes, for every judgment. He who now demands a proof of the principle, that is, an explanation of a reason, hereby assumes it simply already to be true. Indeed, bases his demand on this assumption. He falls into the circle that he demands a proof of the warrant to demand a proof. In the third edition preface to the Metaphysica, Baumgarten brings up arguments in response to criticisms of the Principium Rationis, or Satz vom Grund, and wonders if the principle might not be an identical proposition, not requiring a proof at all. He says, "You demand a proof, or rather a demonstration. Which one? What if I counted the principle of ground among the undemonstrable propositions, that is, those propositions of which you would become completely certain as soon as the mere terms are understood? Your denial of certitude will not refute me, for what if you have not yet understood the terms, that is, what if you confuse the ground and the sufficient ground?" It seems, therefore, that Baumgarten is aware of the issues relating to the justification of the principle of sufficient reason in a way that Wolff is not. He even sees part of Schopenhauer's point, but turns it around, for Schopenhauer had said that the person who demands a proof of the principle of reason assumes it in asking for its justification. Baumgarten presents this point as a criticism from others of the argument for the principle of reason and claims that, in fact, he is not presupposing it. I have discovered some learned men calling this demonstration into doubt in two ways. First, some of them hold that a ground of everything possible is already presupposed in that very demonstration, although it is still in question. Very well, let's see what presupposed, which is ascribed to me, may mean here. I think that I, sensibly, presuppose only those things that I judge to exist, or at least to be possible. Now I ask you, let us carefully read over the demonstration to see whether in it I ever judge that the ground of something possible is possible before the apagogic demonstration is completed, that is, before I have shown that something without ground is contradictory. When I say this ground is either nothing or something, I certainly am not presupposing nor even judging to be possible what I explicitly state with a disjunction to be either impossible or possible. Thus, I really consider the ground of every possible thing to be totally indeterminate throughout the demonstration, and I did not determine its possibility until the conclusion of the demonstration finally indicated that it must be necessary. The critical issue that Baumgarten acknowledges is the universality of the principle. Perhaps one could say there are some things for which there is not a sufficient reason why it is so, and not otherwise. But the principle of sufficient reason itself had better have a reason why it is true. On the other hand, we don't want to get to the position where we are saying there is a reason for everything except for the principle of sufficient reason and God. While Baumgarten points to the differences between ground simpliciter and sufficient ground or sufficient reason, for our purposes this is not significant. What is significant is the claim in section 19 where Baumgarten claims A, that everything is connected, which will become tied up with the claim that everything has a reason or ground, and B, that the connection is rationale or grounded. This should not be surprising given the definition in section 14 of ground as that through which something is knowable or cognizable why it is. At the same time, it is perhaps moderately surprising that this does not play an explicit role in Baumgarten's argument for the principle of reason. The foregoing should suffice concerning Baumgarten's conception of and argument for the principle of reason. Again, while Baumgarten officially, as it were, in the text of the Metaphysica gives an argument that bears some superficial resemblance to the arguments advanced by Wolff, at the same time, he also suggests that the principle of reason is an identical proposition and an axiom, requiring no justification. In this sense, he seems to come closer to Leibniz. These differences are all minor, however. Leibniz, Wolff, and Baumgarten are all clearly in the same camp on the core issue, the universality of the principle of sufficient reason. And this is, of course, part of what it means to be a rationalist. While Kant will not really employ the term rationalism to describe the commitment to the universality of the principle of reason, it is, of course, bound up with the dogmatic use of reason. As we all know, for Kant the faculty of reason seeks the completeness of a system, and for thinkers like Leibniz, Wolff, and Baumgarten, this completeness is tied up with the conception that everything has a ground, that everything is connected. 5. Reason and Faith. This chapter began with the story of Baumgarten's supposed mythologic death. Let us return to this subject now. What is it that faith could give Baumgarten that philosophy could not? Does Baumgarten's death really show that he rejected reason and philosophy? One might be able to read the story of his death as simply confirming a certain faith that he always had, one in which there were certain truths that unaided human reason could not show us. Perhaps this is consistent with what one finds in the Metaphysica. All truths are connected in the mind of God, and God can reveal certain truths to the minds of men, but they are not all discoverable by human beings. The three philosophers who have been at the center of this paper, Leibniz, Wolff, and Baumgarten, are all committed to the conformity of faith and reason. Following Leibniz, for example, Wolff claims that something is above reason if it cannot be demonstrated from the principle of reason, whereas that which is contrary to reason conflicts with the principle of reason. But further, in the natural world there simply is nothing that is above reason, for everything in the natural world is explicable with reference to the principle of sufficient reason. This does not mean that we, finite human beings, will be able to understand everything. It does not mean that we can grasp all reasons for all things. But it does mean that in principle we could, for everything is governed by the principle of sufficient reason. That is, we could do so if our cognitive capacities were greater than they are and approaching the infinite intellect of God. Indeed, one could go further and claim that, for the rationalist Baumgarten, this must be so, since the world is the product of the divine and rational mind. To assert that the infinite and omniscient being God is a rational mind is not to assert that the being is in some sense super smart. It is to assert that there is a reason for everything, that all truths have grounds. Ultimately, these reasons or grounds will also be tied up with the benevolence and justice of God. As we have seen, Baumgarten would seem to endorse precisely this position as well. After all, he advocates the position that everything in the natural world is connected, hence grounded and rational. But he also allows for the possibility of miracles. His characterization of the supernatural is close to that of Leibniz. It is when an event does not follow from, that is not grounded in, the essence of the contingent things of the world. His argument that miracles and the supernatural are possible is just this: the natural and naturally ordinary are contingent in every world. There is a possible world in which there are events that arise from a source other than the essences of contingent beings. Therefore, miracles are possible. And in Baumgarten's view, as opposed to the view of the naturalists, this world might be one in which there are miracles. For we know that God chooses the best of all possible worlds, and that, as Baumgarten tells us in section 441, in the most perfect world there is the greatest universal nexus, harmony, and agreement that is possible in a world. To understand the role of faith and its relation to reason in Baumgarten's life and philosophy, we also have to look at the place of revelation in his metaphysics. The work, in fact, concludes with a discussion of the last branch of metaphysics, natural theology. There he defines revelation in the strict sense as divine supernatural revelation given to humans through speech, and claims that it is actual in this world whenever religion cannot be actualized equally well through natural revelation alone. There is, according to Baumgarten, nothing contrary to reason in revelation and faith. Revelation, in the strict sense, signifies supremely possible things. Now, those things which go against reason are impossible. Therefore, neither revelation, either in the strict or the strictest sense, nor holy faith taken objectively, go against reason. Indeed, those things that go against reason are not the revelation of God, either in the strict or the strictest sense, nor are they holy faith taken objectively. This account allows Baumgarten to conclude that naturalists and atheists are in error. A naturalist in the stricter sense denies the revelation of God in the strict sense in this world. The theoretical atheist denies the existence of God and errs. In neither sense does naturalism necessarily maintain atheism. And he concludes the entire book thus: if naturalists in the stricter sense deny that revelation in the strict sense exists in this world because, 1, it is a supernatural event, and hence seems impossible, because 2, they believe holy faith to be against reason and hence impossible, or 3, because they deny divine providence over the human race, then they err through their own fault, and are ignorant of the most benign God, whose honor, name, and praise shall always remain. The point should be clear. Baumgarten is trying to maintain a commitment to rationalism, understood as, among other things, a commitment to the principle of sufficient reason and the in-principle intelligibility of the world, while rejecting the pull of naturalism and atheism. After all, the classic, perhaps oversimplified view of the pietists was that rationalism entailed naturalism, which in turn entailed atheism. This view was simply part of the standard rhetoric which sought to make rationalism truly unbearable by assimilating it with a certain extreme version of Spinozism. But Baumgarten is trying to show that there is logical space for another kind of view, and this is an important part of his philosophical project and self-definition in the Metaphysica. In this chapter, I have tried to make sense of an anachronistic label in connection with Baumgarten's philosophy, rationalism. As I've said, this is not a term he used in connection with his own thought, but in the concluding section of the Metaphysics, we can see what he wanted to show that he was not, a naturalist and an atheist. This is of some interest, for the Leibnizian and Wolffian philosophies had been tarred by pietist opponents as leading to the determinism and atheism of that dreaded naturalist Spinoza. And it should be clear that Baumgarten, like Leibniz and Wolff before him, wants to distance himself from him. In all honesty, I do not believe that I can really save Baumgarten from Mendelssohn's harsh judgment of his deathbed utterances, for I tend to share it. But I do think we can see a non-trivial way in which Baumgarten's pietist background might be at work in the Metaphysics, especially in its concluding sections. Not only is it the case that Baumgarten there tries to separate rationalism from naturalism and atheism, he also makes a strong plea for some rather central Orthodox Christian positions. Let us consider again the final section of the Metaphysics. According to Baumgarten, there are three ways in which the naturalist errs when he denies revelation. 1, by claiming that it is a supernatural event. 2, by denying a conformity of faith and reason. Or 3, by rejecting divine providence. We have already seen that Baumgarten believes that there can be no disharmony between faith and reason, because both reveal truths to us. And clearly, on Baumgarten's view, there should be no reason to reject divine providence because the world simply is the product of the benevolent and omniscient Creator. The crucial issue is whether or not revelation is a supernatural event and hence impossible. But for Baumgarten, revelation, like a miracle, is possible. More than that, as he puts it in an earlier section, God is the author of universal nature. Therefore, whatever a creature understands through its own nature about the mind of God according to universal nature, it knows through divine revelation, which is natural. So there are many instances of our coming to have a deep understanding of the nature of the world and the nature of the divine mind that count as a kind of divine, natural revelation. Again, what about Baumgarten's deathbed confession? According to his Metaphysics, holy faith concerns certain truths that are naturally unknowable by creatures. But there need not be a tension between the claims of a rationalist, who holds that all truths have a ground, and someone who asserts that some truths cannot, because of human finitude, be known by human beings through their unaided reason. As Baumgarten says, the holy mysteries are those things posited as beyond the reason of creatures in holy faith taken objectively. And, as we know from Baumgarten, neither revelation nor holy faith go against reason. The charitable reading of Baumgarten's final days, therefore, ought to recognize that the tension that one imagines to exist between reason and faith never really existed in Baumgarten's mind. This is perhaps the way to reconcile pietism and rationalism. 2. Determination, determinability, and the structure of ends. Baumgarten's Ontology and Beyond. Angelica Nuzzo. Even a cursory look at the vast philosophical literature of the German Aufklärung up to Kant, and then, in Kant's aftermath, up to Hegel, reveals a family of terms that are employed more frequently than any others, and the importance of which interpreters often seem unaware. They are sometimes used casually as direct inheritance of the metaphysical scholastic tradition, sometimes in a programmatic way, sometimes to introduce new and not-so-new philosophical slogans. This is either because these terms are implicitly taken for granted in their accepted technical validity, or because they are connected to other specific problems that are being directly investigated, while the broader context to which these terms refer always fades away. I am referring to the terminological family that covers verbs, adjectives, and substantives expressing variations on the theme of bestimmen, Bestimmung, Bestimmbarkeit, and their Latin cognates, determinare, determinatio, determinabilitas, along with the negative unbestimmt, indeterminatum. These terms cover a broad range of philosophical issues, which in the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century are both traditional problems and distinctively new issues. It is not my intention here to provide a history of the term and the concept of determinatio in this period. My aim is instead to show the crucial, although often indirect role that Baumgarten's metaphysics plays in shaping these developments. While Baumgarten's presence is easily acknowledged with regard to Kant, although even in this case Baumgarten's philosophy is often conflated with Christian Wolff's or subsumed under the generic designation of scholastic metaphysics, his contribution is completely erased in the aftermath of the critical philosophy. It seems that the tacit dominating assumption herein is that Kant's critique of dogmatic metaphysics has made any positive reference to Baumgarten's own metaphysics a losing proposition. Under this assumption, however, interpreters have all but closed the way to a possible retrieval of themes from Baumgarten's metaphysics after Kant. In this regard, Baumgarten's metaphysics has fared indeed quite differently in the history of its interpretation and reception than his aesthetics. One of my aims in this chapter is to begin correcting this historiographical picture. I argue that in his metaphysics, Baumgarten introduces a notion of determinatio that departs from late medieval metaphysics, which in this respect either does not associate with it any epistemic or logical function, or makes use of a distinctively different vocabulary. Such a notion, in its being at once traditional and innovative, has far-reaching consequences with regard to the broad array of issues that the concept ends up covering in later German philosophy. These are questions that range from metaphysics to logic, epistemology and aesthetics, and from ethics to psychology and the philosophy of history. In this case as well, while I will not even attempt to cover all these areas, I shall hint at the deeper systematic structure present in Baumgarten's metaphysics that may explain why the notion of determinatio as Bestimmung has lent itself to this wide range of developments. In the ontology of his metaphysics, as we shall see, Baumgarten consolidates the epistemologism and logicism that also characterizes Wolff's ontology by lending to determinatio both a logical and a metaphysical significance, making it constitutive of the structure of ens, that is, of essence and existence, and of the nexus in which being is placed and connecting it with the problem of individuality, which merges significantly with that of discernibility. In the first part of the chapter, I offer an analysis of the beginning of Baumgarten's ontology by addressing the progression leading from possible to connexum to ens, where the issue of determinatio and that of the universal, internal, and external determinations of being are thematically introduced. On the basis of this analysis, I draw some fundamental implications with regard to Baumgarten's monadological and harmonistic ontological doctrine, point to some important divergences from Wolff, and bring to light his epistemologism, whereby the determinations of being, its determinability, and the act of its determination, as predication, are connected with the universal principles of contradiction, sufficient reason, and excluded middle. Herein we also find one of the main issues to which Kant's critical reflections on, and reworking of, Baumgarten's ontology are directed, as early as in the 1760s. In the second part of the chapter I examine some implications that the metaphysical and logical constellation disclosed by the first part of the ontology has in the contemporary and post-Kantian discussion. While I shall not directly address Kant's position at any length, I shall treat him as the turning point responsible for the direction taken by the reflection on this topic in his aftermath. In particular, I present 3 cases, which I will be able to examine only in a very limited way with regard to the topic at issue. First, Thomas Abt's discussion of Johann Joachim Spalding's Betrachtung über die Bestimmung des Menschen with regard to the notion of a Bestimmung des Menschen, an exchange that is crucial for Fichte's own book with the same title published in 1800. Secondly, Solomon Maimon's Satz der Bestimmbarkeit, and finally Hegel's Logic of Being in the Science of Logic, which I suggest can be read as the final appropriation and radical transformation of Baumgarten's ontology. 1. Determinatio and the structure of being, ens. In the prolegomena that open the metaphysics, Baumgarten offers his definition of metaphysics as the science of the first principles of human cognition. Ontology is in turn presented as the science of the general predicates of being. Already revealing his epistemologism, Baumgarten departs here from Wolff's own more Aristotelian-sounding definition of ontology, or first philosophy, as the science of being in general. Since the most general predicates of being are the first principles of human cognition, Baumgarten concludes that ontology is the first discipline of metaphysics, followed by cosmology, psychology, and natural theology. Significantly, the most general predicates of being, universal internal predicates as well as disjunctive relative predicates, are said to refer to the intelligibility of individuals. They are predicates that are in singulis. Thereby, from the outset, Baumgarten sets an emphasis on being as individual, thereby following the late medieval tradition, Suarez in particular. To be, or to be an possible individual ens, is to be open to the determining power of the intellect, which is expressed in the operation of ascribing predicates to a subject. The predicates of being are that, quid, by virtue of which being becomes intelligible, that is, that on the basis of which being is, and is something, aliquid, rather than nothing. In sum, ontology for Baumgarten is the science of the first principles of cognition that are the general, or traditionally the transcendental, predicates of beings insofar as they are individuals. The central questions with which ontology is concerned are, what is ens, and what are its structures? Baumgarten's answer is that ens, being, and ding, is the possible determinable with regard to existence. Possibile qua existentiam determinabile est ens. This is a technical definition that presupposes the notions of the possible, the connexum, and of determination, determinability, along with the principles of contradiction, reason, and sufficient reason, and finally the concepts of essence and existence. For Baumgarten, determination always takes place within a nexus and refers to the relation of ratio and rationatum. Determination is the fundamental hinge that connects, in an apparently seamless way, at least for Baumgarten, the possible to the actual, and leads the possible into existence. However, determination is, first and foremost, determination of the possible, as determinable but also as determinate. In effect, ontologically, possibility is properly determinability. Although Wolff's definition of philosophy as science of the possible as possible is not to be found in Baumgarten, the starting point of the ontology is, as is customary, the possible. Most accurately, however, the starting point is the impossible, the nihil negativum, which is impossible because contradictory and non-representable. In his Ontologia, Wolff dedicates the first section of his investigation into the nature of being as such to the principles of first philosophy, that is, to the exposition of the principles of contradiction and sufficient reason, offering for them, to begin with, an empirical and psychological account. Our mind, Wolff claims, experiences that if it judges something to be, it cannot at the same time judge it not to be. Baumgarten, by contrast, connects these principles to the very structure of being and thematizes them accordingly. Thereby he seems to confer to these principles a more markedly ontological validity, although the impossibility of the contradictory is presented at the same time as the impossibility of its representation. According to the same line of argument, the possible as something, aliquid, etwas, is that which is representable and does not involve contradiction. The principle of the excluded middle is derived from the previous propositions. The definitions of ratio, which Baumgarten translates with Grund, Rationatum, Folge, and Nexus, Verknüpfung, introduce the absolute and the relative consideration of the possible and impossible, while in the next section on the connexum these concepts lead to the formulation of the principle of sufficient reason and to the principium rationati. With regard to the former, it is significant that, whereas Wolff lists the principle of sufficient reason after the principle of contradiction in the separate and preliminary consideration of the first principles of ontology, Baumgarten brings it to bear directly on the ontological context of the connexum. The principium rationati, instead, is a distinctive principle of Baumgarten's ontology absent in Wolff and generally confused by the Wolffians with the idea of nexus. Ratio indicates for Baumgarten a Grund for cognition, that in virtue of which the why something is becomes knowable, cognoscibile. This is, verbatim, Wolff's own definition of the principle of sufficient reason. The rationatum is that which is connected to the ratio as it depends on it. That is, it is that which has a ratio, or that of which something is ratio. These two concepts exhaust the realm of the possible, since everything that is possible is either ratio or rationatum, or both, and this leads to the nexus, which nothing possible escapes. Nexus is the predicate through which something is either ratio or rationatum, or both. That is, it is that predicate that, connecting ratio to its rationatum and vice versa, renders the possible intelligible in its inner relational structure. The possible, however, can be considered or represented in itself or absolutely, spectatur in se, that is, not in connection with that which is posited outside of it, that is, its rationatum. The possible in this case is the intrinsically possible. Kant will comment in the first critique that this is the least that can be said of an object. From early on, as attested by the 1762 through 1764 lectures of the Metaphysik Herder, Kant's work on these initial sections of Baumgarten's Metaphysica is informed by Christian August Crucius's critique of Wolffianism. This critique leads Kant to distinguish formal from material principles against Wolff's logicism that reduces all principles to the logical principle of contradiction, and against Baumgarten's confusion between the two. No real ground can be logical and vice versa, says Kant, commenting on Baumgarten's definitions of ratio and rationatum at section 14. The distinction between the logical or formal order and the real or rather wirklich or material order is the crucial framework that Kant takes from Crucius and uses it